groups that I'm going to concentrate on in this talk, principally looking at the ones that you'd see around our coast. So I'm going to start with the true jellyfish and the hydroids. And I thought I'd just start by sharing the life strategy because it helps to understand why we do and don't see them at certain times of the year and why they can be successful at surviving environmental changes. So this is sort of the form that we think of when we think of a jellyfish, this bell-shaped medusa, and they are usually male and female, but they can switch in some species, and they'll this is the generation that releases the eggs and sperm in some form to create a larva. And this will then settle onto a hard substrate and grow into the polyp form. And if the conditions are right, it will start to elongate and gradually break off bits along the end. And each of those bits will turn into a new jellyfish of the shape that we're used to seeing. It's quite a complicated lifestyle and they're very different looking stages. I think the thing to say is that it's been very successful for lots of species of jellyfish, because if you take this larva settling on, say, a rocky shore, if the conditions are bad, quite often they can just turn into a cyst and outweigh changes in the environment. If they do grow into a polyp, they could stay like this for years. I think in the laboratory, they've kept the moon jellyfish for up to 26 years in this stage. They can actually grow asexually by budding and eventually decide to produce this medusa that we would consider to be the adults. And there are a couple of species that have been shown to be able to kind of reverse this process. I'm sure we'd all like to go back a bit. So they'll shrink and eventually settle back as a polyp and just wait for conditions to improve again. That's like the idealized life cycle, and lots of them have variations in that, and some of them don't do all of that. So I'll touch on that as we go through the presentation. And the picture at the below is just to show you the polyps of the moon jellyfish. So if we take the true jellyfish, so talking first about the ones that we would expect to see along South Devon, but also around the whole of the southwest, probably all familiar with the compass jellyfish. And then we've got various pictures of them stranded. And you can see how much variation there is in the colour patterns that we can see. They're quite an interesting species. They reproduce all year, but they're reported to have an alternation in sex. So the small ones start out as male, and then after they've reproduced once, they will turn into females. But don't let the small size convince you that they don't pack a punch, because I've swum with ones the size of a tennis ball where the tentacles have been actually much longer than I am. Whereas some of the larger ones seem to have shorter tentacles. So just because you see a small one, don't assume it's got short tentacles. One thing to notice on here is these spots around the bell. And it's quite nice because they're coloured here, these regions. In lots of jellyfish and hydroids, these aren't coloured, but they contain a pit that has some sense cells in them. And so one of the things I'll talk about later on are statocysts, which are cells that can sense gravity and help the jellyfish know whether they're up or down. So these tend to be distributed around the margins of the bell in pits, and sometimes they have other sense organs there as well. So some species can detect light, for instance. So this one's quite easy to identify if you're in the UK waters. It's the only one with these distinctive V-shaped patterns. The next one is the moon jellyfish, which probably most people have seen. Most of our reportings in South Devon come from around the Torbay area, Anstey's Cove. Other than that, as a survey, we get most of our reportings from North Devon, where they're stranded, usually in quite large numbers along the beaches. So this one's quite translucent and it's harder to make out the arms, but they are there, the four arms. If you've come across it stranded on the beach, it can be harder to spot because it dries out very quickly and degrades quite quickly. One of the characteristics of the moon jellyfish are these four rings, but don't get hung up on it if you see 5 rings or 6 rings. Like all these characteristics, you can get abnormalities. So there's an example there showing you that this one actually had 5 rings. One thing to be wary of in the scientific literature, I've seen articles that say that the pink are males and the brown are females, these gonads, and I've seen the exact opposite as well in other scientific papers. I've tried to dig down more deeply and found quite a wide survey that covered a large geographic range and found just general variation according to the area. And so we would find that in some areas, the females would all be one colour, but in a different area, that same colour would be the males. So don't get pulled into that. When you look at this species, when it's whole and swimming, it's fairly easy to spot, but when it strands on the beach, you might just get, say, half of the jellyfish and these gonads might not be there. So one thing to look at are these radial canals that come from the center of the jellyfish out to the edges. And if you look at them, most of them are branching. So we've got one there that isn't, but most of the others branch. And it's not exactly a regular pattern, but there's a lot of branching going on, and that might help you later on. I'll point out some of the species. The blue jellyfish is one that's commonly reported. I haven't had as many reports this year, and we have quite a lot of reports around Torbay and also around the Falmouth area. We don't have as many usually coming from the North Devon, but I think that might just be that we don't get many reports in general from North Devon rather than the species aren't there. This one is, if it's blue, it's quite easy to know that it is the blue jellyfish if it has this colour, because if you look, it has an awful lot of tentacles and more than most of the other jellyfish that I'm going to speak about. The oral arms that hang down are more like a curtain, so they're quite dense, making it hard to see through all that curtain of tentacles and arm. And another feature that they have is this ring that then gives way to these radial lines as well that are often purple or blue. So this one here you can see is a browny colour, but it is actually a blue jellyfish. The only one that potentially you could confuse it with would be the lion's mane. So on the top left here, we've got a stranded mature lion's mane. It's got this really dark red, orangey colour, and we've got a stranded blue, and it's very clearly blue. But this photo is out of one of the books that I will reference later, and every single one on here is actually a blue jellyfish, but an immature one. And so you can see that the immature blues can be brown, which is the same colour as the immature lion's mane. So that leaves us wondering whether we've actually seen a blue or a lion's mane. For our purposes, we tend to lump them all together as blue. I'll explain why later, but technically we should call them all cyanea. And I'll go through those identifying characteristics now. But it's not something I'm keen to do with individuals, and certainly you can't do really from a species. So the first thing is the average number of tentacles per group. So the tentacles occur in about 8 groups around the edge of the bell. So in a lion's mane, you have far more, 70 to 150, whereas in the blue, we've got 40 to 60. I don't particularly personally want to go counting tentacles. So then we could look at some of the other characteristics. This next one is very difficult. We have these pit-like intrusions in the muscles that I've talked about that are present in these true jellyfish, or we could look at the number of muscle folds that they actually have. So I'll show you a photograph in a minute. again from the same book. So this is the muscle fold going across the animal, which is the same as I showed earlier in that beached barrel jellyfish. And so on the left, we have the lion's mane, and on the right, we've got the blue. And you can see these pits here. So these are things that you would only really see in a large number in the lion's mane. The folds that it's talking about are each of these lines. These are the folds. So if you were to count from top to bottom here, you would find there are about 13 in a lion's mane, and you would find that there are more in the blue jellyfish. But this picture is a cutaway. They have taken away the oral arms, and they've taken away all those hundreds of tentacles. So to get to this position, you're going to have to flip the jellyfish upside down and move the tentacles and the oral arms out the way. Probably the easiest time to actually do that is if they're stranded on the beach, and quite often then the tentacles and the oral arms have already dropped away. So this is a picture of two. So we've got the lion's mane on the left and the blue on the right. I've blown this up so far. I wouldn't be able to see these with the naked eye. I probably need to get a magnifying glass. But on the right, we've got the muscles here of the blue, which look fairly bare. And I think you can just about make out on this that there are some dark circles on these lines of the lion's mane, but it's covered in sand, covered in shells. So it's not the easiest thing to be able to see. The other thing, which is perhaps what most people would go on, is the colour. So we've already said that when they're immature, it's hard to see, but when they're actual adults, if it's red, it is a lion's mane, and if it's blue, it's a blue jellyfish. It's very much the immature stages that are difficult to differentiate. The lion's mane's bigger. It can be up to 1,000 millimeters, the blue only up to about 300 millimeters. And so the reason that we tend to think that we see mainly blues is this bottom one here. The lion's mane is generally seen, or at least the adult's lion's mane, is generally seen on more northerly shores of the UK. So if you were to sort of go up from the Bristol Channel around Scotland and back down towards East Anglia, it's quite common to have the adult lion's mane. We almost never see an adult's lion's mane around the southwest of England. So therefore we tend to think that the juveniles are probably all blues, but we haven't proved that. So we do lump them together. The other one to talk about that you see around the southwest of the true jellyfish is the barrel jellyfish. But we don't often see it in South Devon. But this photo was taken in 2019. This was off of Exmouth, and every one of these dots is a barrel jellyfish. And that same year it was seen in Torquay Harbour, Torquay Marina. People could see them from the sea walls, from the beaches. They were everywhere. That's quite unusual for the southwest. They seem to be slightly deeper water species. They're very common in the Bristol Channel and further up the coast. And we have had reports from people who trawl in the Falmouth Bay area, who trawled them up by the ton in November from about 40 meters deep. So just because we haven't got reports of them doesn't mean they aren't out there, but they certainly haven't been around in the same numbers. In terms of strandings, you've got a much better chance of seeing these because they're a much more substantial jellyfish. So they take a bit longer to degrade and you'll get bits of them. So if you look at this second photo here, if this were a moon jellyfish, it would have degraded much more quickly, and this one's much more substantial. So this quickly, I'll pick these up, but I'm not going to dwell on them. So going from the bottom, we've got the year 2019 and the different coasts up to 2023 and across the months of the year for these different species. But for the blue, you can see we didn't have very many sightings on any coast, particularly in 21, 22. But for the other species, they followed pretty much the same pattern each year. And that's fairly consistent with what we'd expect from the historic records. However, this year we have had a dramatic increase in this particular species. This can be called the purple stinger, the mauve stinger, or the purple meanie. It's currently being reported from, I think, Hope Cove in South Devon is the closest I've had to the rest of South Devon, all the way down to Land's End in really large numbers. So it's a really good bloom. The characteristic features of this, so it's a true jellyfish. It's got these arms, it's got this muscle banding. It only has usually 8 tentacles. They're quite long and substantial, but there's only 8 of them. So you're unlikely to confuse this with a blue jellyfish, because a blue jellyfish is going to have hundreds of tentacles. This one is known to give really quite nasty stings, and unlike the other ones we talked about, it has stinging cells all over the bell as well. So a lot of the others you could pick up or come into contact with the bell and you wouldn't be stung, but that's not true of this one. So last year we had 2 reports of individual animals of Cornwall, and the year before we had 1 off the Minnock Theatre. But they are out there. So this little bit here is the Irish jellyfish survey, and you can see surveys that they did in 2016 and 2017. So the black dots represent sites where they surveyed for jellyfish and didn't find any of these species, and the pink ones represent where they did, and slightly larger if they found higher numbers. And I think they found something fairly similar in the last couple of years. So this is something Keith and I have been corresponding about, because we had this particular photo here from Hope Cove in amongst the other pink jellyfish. And this is actually a juvenile mauve stinger. They turn pink when they mature. They can also be purple. So currently we're getting reports of large blooms with a mixture of these stages. But again, you're unlikely to confuse this with anything else, because the other brown ones, the immature ones we talked about, were the blue and the lion's mane, which would have hundreds of tentacles hanging down. Okay, this one I've included because I feel like we might get this one day soon. This is the Australian spotted jellyfish. We don't have any reports in the UK, but it made its way from Australia to Mexico, then across to the Mediterranean. And I think they've now got a population in the Netherlands. So it's spread quite a long way around, and it could be included. I've just included it because superficially it's a little bit similar to our barrel jellyfish. So if you see what you think is a barrel jellyfish, but it's got a very spotted top, then please think again. It is possible it could be one of these. Okay, so I'm going to quickly move on to the hydroids. Hopefully I'm not running out of time yet. I know that you all do a lot of time on the shores, looking at rocky shores and the animals that live there, and you probably think of hydroids more in this form and haven't really thought about the life cycle, including that bell-shaped medusa that we talked about earlier. Some of the hydroids don't release the medusa, they keep it attached to them at this stage as a bud, but they do have that life cycle. Most of them that release a bell, a medusa, the medusa is only there for a few weeks at a time, which makes it very difficult to build up a picture of which ones are around, because if you're not in the water in those couple of weeks, then you're just not going to see them. But I'm going to go through some of the different ones that you might come across, but I'm going to start with the real oddities, which are the siphonophores. So this one, which has various names, including the long, stringy, stingy thing, is a siphonophore, and we've seen it in the last 2 years in Cornwall, not in Devon. Pretty much the same area, but I think the first recorded occurrence was 2007 off of Plymouth. It's supposed to give really quite severe stings, and pretty much each one of these is a polyp form of the hydroid. Then we've got the Portuguese man of war, which I'm sure you're really all quite familiar with. We tend to think of this as coming in with Atlantic storms. people from North Devon, I'm sure, are going to be really familiar with these washing up. Less so in South Devon, but we do get them. So if we have a really strong Atlantic storm that blows them up the channel, and then we have a change of wind, it can blow them back onto our beaches. But we wouldn't normally expect to see these in calm conditions because they're ocean species, but they are really distinctive. And the thing to remember for these and all the true jellyfish is that these tentacles can sting when they're detached from the animal and when they're on the beach as well until they degrade. So all of these tentacles have little harpoons inside, which are primed and ready to spring out. So if you pick one up at the beach, there's a good chance you might still get stung if you come into contact with the tentacles. The next one usually gets overlooked unless it's turned up in huge masses, like this photo on the left-hand side. This is the by the wind sailor. It's usually there with the Portuguese men of war. I put this one in with the penny so that you can see the sort of size we're talking about. And this one's still got the blue tentacles and organic matter, but within a day or two, that would be lost. And so what would be left on the beach would be this picture on the far right. I tend to think it looks a bit like a fish scale that you notice in amongst all the debris on the beach. It's very easy to overlook these, but they can be there in large numbers. So it's got this sail on top, which is here, and it supports this body underneath, which has lots of different polyps. Now, these are not jellyfish, but I've included them because I know you all like to see the things on the shore, and sometimes these wash up on the shore when we get Portuguese men of war and by the wind sailors because they feed on them. So this nudibranch uses surface tension to stay at the surface of the water, and it can actually use the stinging cells from the jellyfish and put them in its own body. So you could get stung by touching these from a Portuguese man of war sting, say. And then the violet snail here, which you can just see in this picture, creates this raft of bubbles to keep it up at the surface. So both of these prey upon by the wind sailors and Portuguese men of war, but they're not jellyfish. So this is the hydroid that most people think of as a jellyfish, and most of us have probably seen it in the last couple of years, but it was considered to be pretty much a rare sighting and an occasional visitor, but in the last couple of years, particularly last year and this year, we've had them in huge numbers. So this is the crystal jellyfish. So you can see this picture here. I'll come on to the identifying features in a moment, but the main thing I would say is to distinguish this from a moon jellyfish is that these radial lines are pretty much straight. There's no branching really going on at all. And on this one, which is a very lovely pink color, the pink is actually the gonads, and these are stretched out along the radial canals and not curled up in the center like they are in the moon jellyfish. But these won't always be present. So at a glance, if you can see these very straight lines, the chances are you're looking at a crystal jellyfish. I currently think there's about 3 species of crystal jellyfish that are seen in this area. A book by Russell quotes 4 different species, but there's a lot of debate about them. I'm going to go through them individually. But what I'm going to say is that really it's a question of looking at these radial lines and the tentacles, so the tentacle size and how many tentacles you get per radial line. So this is something Keith Hiscock posted that was provided to him by Dave Conway, these images. I'll go through each one in turn. And the information here is taken from Russell's book. There's a mistake in Russell's book, which was pointed out to me about 2 weeks ago. So just sort of corrected that one, but we'll go through them. So one of the species has pretty much 1 tentacle per radial line. And here's an example here. So they don't always perfectly line up, but pretty much 1 tentacle per radial line. And the tentacles are a reasonable size. However, this one has several radial lines before you get to the next tentacle, and the tentacles are really quite short. So you can clearly see here how many radial lines there are between these tentacles. And the third one, Vitrina, has lots of tentacles. So here are 2 radial lines, and you can see there's 3 in between the radial lines and probably 1 at each radial line or 2. So it matches these pictures here. So these are the 3 species we think we've got. Whether or not you're actually able to identify them depends how good your pictures are, or how close you can get to them. Quite a lot of them can be quite badly degraded as well, so you're just seeing a bit of them. And often then the tentacles have actually gone. But it is possible, and people are starting to pay a bit more attention to trying to separate out the species. So of those ones that I've talked about, apart from the long stingy stringy thing, this is where we've been seeing them. So 2019, there was just 1 report of a crystal jellyfish, but since then, and including this year, we've been seeing lots of them. But the Portuguese man of war and the by the wind sailor were traditionally thought of more as a winter-autumn species, tying up with storms, but you can see that we're starting to see them more in the summer as well. I don't know if that trend's going to carry on. So what about the other hydroids? Because I said there's thousands of hydroids. So I'm not going to go through all these different groupings here, but if you really want to start to get towards a species, you're going to have to look at the gonads and decide whether they're on the stomach or on this radial canal. And you're also going to have to look at whether or not they have statocysts, which are these cells that can be used to detect gravity and determine which way up the animal is. So I'm going to show you some examples, but I'm not going to go through identifying them to species. So these ones all have some kind of cross pattern through the center. We've got some that are orange, some that are pink, a different shaped pink one with very clear markings where the statocysts would be, white crosses as well. So you can look at keys and get these to species, but you're going to need very clear pictures. And I'll show you some of the key in a second. This is not a picture from the southwest of England, but recently somewhere on Facebook, I saw someone post something that looked very like this. This is actually a picture from the Hebrides. And so we've got a cross one here, but we've got these other ones as well. So it's something to start looking out for. But this is part of a key for the ones with the cross center. And you can see that they have different shaped gonads, different positions along the radial lines, different numbers and lengths of tentacles. So there's quite a lot of potential candidates. Obelia is a species you probably are familiar with from rocky shores. But you're going to need to have really clear pictures or get very close to them and look at them perhaps with a magnifying glass. The other shaped hydroids you often see are these. I tend to think of these as looking a bit like an alien brain. And again, you're going to have to look at the tentacles, the bulb of the tentacles, the positioning of the stomach and gonads, and the overall shape. Some of them are just incredibly beautiful, but all of these are incredibly small. So they're not very big. And actually these photos are a little bit difficult to identify from, but they're actually really good considering how small these animals are and how fast they are. And here's part of a key. So the Leucotiara species here, you can see they're quite similar. So you're really going to have to be looking quite carefully at these tentacles and also the placement of the interior. So not easy, but not impossible. And I will put some links to some of those keys. And then quickly, I'm going to talk about the comb jellies, salps, and oddities. So these 3 are species that we definitely have around our coast. We've definitely seen them a lot more in recent years. Not so much this year, but in recent years, you've been able to see them from the shore walking along. breakwaters and harbours. So there's been a lot around and lots of reports. Most of them have tentacles, but not this one here, Burrowie. This one is a voracious predator that preys on the others and anything it can get hold of. And this year we did see a photograph from someone saying that it was very big, about a foot long, which is quite a surprising length for these. The next one is the northern comb jelly. So this picture actually is taken and has both of them in the same bloom, but I put this one here to show you the features a bit more. So they have these oral lobes here, and they're quite short in this species, which I'll come on to in a minute. This is a nice picture of the sea gooseberry, which really is the size of a gooseberry. It's really tiny, but these are the combs that we've talked about that beat and make these really nice patterns in the water. And it has got these two long tentacles, much longer than its own body. And you can see from this picture, these stones are really tiny and they're quite hard to spot on the beach. But when they do wash up, they're often there in large numbers, so it is quite possible to see them. This species on the right-hand side, we technically don't have in this country, but I think from the way that we collect data, it'd be very hard to be certain of that. Comb jellies don't do well in trawl nets, they just disintegrate. And then when you're in the water, it's very hard to take pictures of them that give you the key identification. So on the left-hand side is our species, and here we have these oral lobes, and they are about half of the body. And a bit further up, we have the statocyst. But in this invasive one, the statocyst is level with the termination of these oral lobes. The reason it's mentioned is because this is another invasive species that's been blamed for crashes in fish populations in the Adriatic, the Mediterranean, and has been seen again all the way around the coast up to Denmark area. So there's no reason why we wouldn't have it. I'm just not sure that we would be able to pick up that we did have it. And then we've got the salps. So they were here this year and last year. The year before, we just had one or two reportings, and really we had one or two reportings of these thin string ones. But this year we've had confirmation that we've got 3 different species, these long strings, these large giant coils. So you can see a diver here. You can see just how big they are. And then this other unusual species here, which we do have the names for if anyone wants to know. And it's been really unusual. And these salp blooms have been all the way along the coast of Cornwall and Scilly Isles again. So really quite dramatic. And this is a photo from last year of someone swimming through the stringy ones. And another photograph here of the larger ones on someone's hand in the Scilly Isles. And you can see that 2019, we didn't have any reports. 2010, there were just 10 reported at Sennen Cove. We had a few reported at Porthcerris in 2021, but it wasn't until 2023 that we really got these huge blooms. So we've had a few, but what's happened in the last 2 years has been really unusual. I've included this one, which is not a jellyfish or anything to do with any of the species that I've talked about, but it's an oddity. And quite often people see this on the beach and think it's part of the barrel jellyfish. They think it's one of the arms, but it's actually part of the sea butterfly. It's called a Venus slipper. I think it's quite beautiful. Oops. I've included the stalk jellyfish, not because we do much with them, but they are quite often reported and I just record them when they are. This is someone's thumbnail and here's a stalk jellyfish, and definitely my eyesight is not good enough to ever notice these. But some people are amazing, and I'm sure there's people amongst your group who are and spot these and may even have contributed these pictures. They do have stinging cells, so they are very close relatives of true jellyfish. They go through the life cycle, but they always remain attached, so they never actually release. And really, this is kind of an upside down jellyfish. So I'm pretty much at the end. If I could really recommend this book if people want to know about jellyfish in general and their ecology. And it's a fantastic book by Lisa Ann Gershwin, who's one of the experts in jellyfish. But it's also about the state of our oceans and the role jellyfish may or may not play in that. It's really fascinating. I've included this here, and I think we're going to share the presentation. So this just gives you some of the basic features that if you decide you do want to look closer at some of the keys to just understand what bits of the jellyfish they're actually talking about. And these are the guides. So the top one, it's really, really good. It was written for a deliberate jellyfish sampling expedition around Scotland. And it's got some really fantastic photos of those hydroids. And it's just really, really nice. Probably includes species that we don't have because they tend to get more cold water species, but does definitely cover quite a few of our species. The next two are Russell's volumes, which are fantastic, have so much information. Out of print now, very expensive to buy, but kindly the MBA provide them free of charge, so you can download them from here. If you're really interested, you really need to sort of have these books. There's a couple of other keys, and then I've included 2 European guides, which have some species that we don't have in the UK, but there's no reason why we don't have them. And I also like the way that they tell you how to deal with the stings of the different species. So we're really lucky in the UK. I'm not going to go about stings very much, just to say in the UK, the way you deal with them is exactly what's on the NHS website, and it's quite straightforward. You definitely don't put vinegar on them because that can make the stinging cells trigger. And so if you've got a tentacle on your arm and not all the cells have actually fired, if you put vinegar on it, they'll all fire. So you'll get a worse sting. Other parts of the world have different jellyfish. Different jellyfish have different venoms and react in different ways. So other parts of the world, vinegar is absolutely the right thing to put on them. So it's kind of important to know. So I quite like these guides for that reason, and also the fact they give you an idea of what other jellyfish might be out there. So that was a real whistle-stop tour of the sort of gross morphology ideas of how to recognize the jellyfish around our coast. I thought I'd stop there rather than going on